Rhiannon Vexley had spent the entirety of her 18 years behind the stone walls of the Vexley estate, a crumbling southern mansion that once bore the elegance of old wealth, but now sagged with the weight of secrets and silence. Her life, since the age of 12, had been a quiet captivity under the rule of her stepmother Corliss, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty and whose social ambitions far exceeded the dwindling Vexley fortune. After Rhiannon's father, Dr. Howard Vexley, an esteemed art historian, died in what was publicly deemed an accident, but privately whispered to be something darker, Corliss wasted no time seizing control. The estate was stripped piece by piece, antique paintings sold in secret, heirloom furniture replaced with cold, modern replicas, and Rhiannon herself reduced from cherished daughter to liability. Corliss never laid a hand on Rhiannon, but her neglect was its own form of violence. Rhiannon was pulled from school, educated by disinterested tutors, and forbidden to leave the estate grounds. Her world narrowed to dusty books, whispered dreams, and the distant sound of laughter she was never allowed to join. She spent her days roaming the shadowed corridors of the house, speaking only to the maids who pitied her, but dared not defy their employer. Despite the isolation, or perhaps because of it, Rhiannon developed a rich internal world. She read voraciously, often by candlelight when the electricity flickered in the storm-beaten house. Her imagination, vivid and restless, was her only freedom. She dreamed of escape, of life beyond the rusted gates and the cold stares of Corliss's social circle. But dreams, she had learned, could be dangerous when you had nothing else. On the evening of her 18th birthday, a storm rolled in over the lowlands, thunder cracking the sky open in jagged bolts. The house trembled with every clap, the old windows rattling like bones. Rhiannon was alone in her attic room, reading a tattered collection of Gothic poems, when she was summoned downstairs by one of the housekeepers. The woman, pale and nervous, offered no explanation. Only, "Your stepmother wants you in the drawing room. Now." Rhiannon descended the staircase slowly, her fingers trailing the banister polished by years of ritual, but dulled by neglect. The drawing room had been her father's favorite place, high-ceilinged, filled with dark wood and floor-to-ceiling shelves. Now it was cold, stripped of personality, and suffocating with tension. Corliss stood by the hearth, her wineglass in hand, lipstick smudged at the rim. Across from her, standing silently near the window, was a man Rhiannon had never seen before. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders wrapped in a charcoal wool coat that shimmered faintly with rain. His posture was straight but not stiff, like someone who had endured battles both literal and emotional. His face was carved with sharp lines, high cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with the shadow of a beard, and a long scar that ran along his left cheekbone down to his jawline, faded but unmistakable. His eyes, a molten gray that seemed to burn and freeze at once, met hers the moment she stepped into the room. She froze under that gaze, not because it was cruel, but because it was unreadable. "This is Mr. Maddox Rourke," Corliss said, swirling her wine lazily. "He's here on behalf of a debt. Your father made arrangements before his death." Her tone was flippant, as though she were discussing a misplaced necklace, not the fate of her stepdaughter. "You belong to him now." The room went silent, save for the fire crackling behind the grate and the distant growl of thunder outside. Rhiannon's heart slammed against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maddox didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her. She opened it with trembling hands. It was a contract notarized and dated, signed by her father and Maddox Rourke 3 months before Dr. Vexley's death. It stated in explicit legal language that should Howard Vexley fail to repay a sizable personal loan within 1 year, the debt would be transferred, not in money but in guardianship, of Rhiannon. It was legal, it was real, and it was binding. "I had no idea," Rhiannon said, backing away as if the paper might burn her fingers. Her vision blurred with shock. "He never told me. He would never." "Your father was desperate," Corliss cut in, her tone sharpened now, cruel. "You think he maintained all this with tenure and book royalties? Please. He sold everything, including you. Maddox was kind enough to wait until your birthday to collect." Maddox's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His expression remained unreadable, though Rhiannon noticed something flicker behind his eyes. A shadow, perhaps even guilt. He turned toward her fully and said, "We should go." She looked at him then, really looked. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only a deep, guarded weariness, like a man carrying a burden so heavy he could barely stand beneath it. For reasons she couldn't explain, that made her hesitate. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What do you want from me?" His voice was low, almost reluctant. "Only that you come with me. I won't harm you, Rhiannon. You have my word." Corliss snorted, draining her wineglass. "It's done. She's yours now. Try not to break her too quickly." Rhiannon stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hand, as Maddox opened the door to the storm outside. Rain whipped through the gap, soaking the threshold. He extended his hand, not demanding, but steady, waiting. And slowly, with her heart beating so loudly she could hear nothing else, Rhiannon stepped forward, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. She didn't take his hand. She walked past him into the night, barefoot and shivering, choosing whatever lay ahead over the cold, crumbling prison behind her. The rain didn't let up as they drove deeper into the countryside, away from Charleston's fading lights and into a darkness that seemed endless. The inside of the SUV was silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of tires slicing through waterlogged roads. Rhiannon sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, soaked curls clinging to her cheeks and neck. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her mind was a tangle of disbelief, fear, and questions she didn't dare ask. Maddox sat in the front passenger seat beside his driver, not once turning to look at her. He was still, composed, and silent as stone, as if this were just another business transaction to be dealt with and then forgotten. Hours passed before the vehicle finally turned off the main road and onto a private drive that wound its way up a steep, forested hill. Fog rolled low over the ground, and the trees loomed like watchful sentinels, thick and tangled with moss. As they ascended, Rhiannon caught glimpses of the sea, wild and black, crashing against the rocks below. The mansion came into view suddenly, massive, old and solemn, its spires and gables piercing the mist like the silhouette of a forgotten castle. The property was surrounded by wrought iron gates and overgrown gardens, the gravel drive lined with lanterns that flickered dimly in the storm. When the car came to a stop, Maddox stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand this time. He didn't speak. The driver opened her door and Rhiannon, numb and disoriented, followed silently into the night. She expected to be led into darkness, perhaps to some cold, drafty chamber or a locked room. But when the heavy oak doors swung open, she was greeted instead by warmth and flickering light. The foyer of the mansion was grand, but not sterile. It was lived in, with polished wooden floors, high ceilings, and a sweeping staircase adorned with carved railings. The scent of wood smoke and aged leather filled the air. A fire burned in a nearby hearth, casting soft shadows on the velvet curtains and oil paintings that lined the walls. Maddox gestured toward a side hallway. "This way," he said, his voice calm, quiet, but with an edge that made her spine stiffen. He led her down a corridor to a large suite at the far end of the west wing. The room was breathtaking, more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. Deep crimson and navy tones decorated the bedding and curtains. An ornate fireplace blazed with warmth. A small sitting area was arranged near the window, with bookshelves lined from floor to ceiling. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt prepared. "This is your space," Maddox said, not stepping beyond the doorway. "You're not a prisoner here. You're free to leave your room, walk the grounds, explore the house. No one will stop you, but there are areas that are off limits. If a door is locked, you respect it. Understood?" Rhiannon nodded slowly, too overwhelmed to respond properly. She glanced around again, absorbing the strange juxtaposition between luxury and unease. Maddox's expression was unreadable. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if wanting to say more, but ultimately he just nodded and turned away. "I'll have someone bring you dry clothes. There's food in the kitchen. Eat when you're ready." And with that, he was gone. The door didn't lock behind him. She stood alone for a long time, her wet dress clinging to her body, her limbs trembling from shock. Eventually, she peeled off the soaked layers, wrapping herself in one of the soft robes hanging on the back of the door. The warmth of the fire did little to thaw the frost of confusion in her chest. Who was this man? Why had her father given her away like a bargaining chip? And more importantly, what did Maddox want with her? She ate a small meal that had been delivered without a sound, then sat by the window watching the rain. Somewhere deep in the mansion, she heard faint piano music echoing through the halls. A low, mournful melody that felt less like entertainment and more like a confession. She closed her eyes, the sound wrapping around her like a lullaby, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep not from exhaustion, but from a strange, uneasy peace. In the morning, she woke in silk sheets, sunlight pouring through the arched windows. The storm had passed. The sea below was calmer now, and birds called from the cliffs. She expected Maddox to appear, to demand something, to remind her that she didn't belong here. But he didn't come. Instead, a note had been placed on her breakfast tray in neat masculine handwriting. You are not here by choice, but you are not without choices. Make the house your own. I will not bother you unless you seek me first. MR. It wasn't what she had anticipated. Not obedience, not command, but space. And it frightened her more than any demand ever could. Rhiannon spent the day exploring the hallways, silently passing the staff who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. The house was massive, filled with libraries, salons, galleries, and locked doors, many of them. She traced her fingers along paintings, paused by windows, and watched Maddox from afar as he moved through the house like a ghost. Always alone, always composed, always at a distance. She found herself wondering what was behind the locked doors. What secrets this house, this man, was trying to keep buried. And perhaps most dangerously of all, what it would mean if she chose not to run from it. The days that followed unfolded with a strange rhythm, a quiet routine unlike any Rhiannon had known before. Mornings arrived in golden shafts of light filtered through heavy curtains, accompanied by the scent of fresh pastries and tea left on a silver tray by someone who never knocked. She would rise slowly, wrap herself in velvet or cashmere from the wardrobe that had been filled, somehow accurately, with her sizes and tastes, and begin her solitary exploration of the mansion. The house was vast, far larger than it had appeared from the drive, with countless hallways and forgotten wings that whispered with age. Paintings watched her pass, old clocks ticked like distant heartbeats. The walls felt alive, but not threatening, just burdened. Maddox remained elusive. She caught glimpses of him here and there, in the library on the stone balcony above the sea, disappearing into one of the many rooms she had not yet dared to enter. When their eyes met, something would pass between them. Not warmth, not yet, but a flicker of understanding. He was a man used to silence, but his eyes betrayed an awareness of her presence, a silent acknowledgement that she was not invisible. On the fifth night, sleep evaded her completely. The storm had returned, soft and distant this time, wrapping the house in a cocoon of rain and thunder. She wandered the corridors barefoot, the hem of her silk robe brushing the cold marble floors. Her curiosity, fed by days of restrained movement and unanswered questions, drew her toward the east wing, where the atmosphere shifted. The air was colder there, the light dimmer. Most of the doors were locked, but one, near the end of a narrow hallway, was slightly ajar. It wasn't the grandest door. In fact, it was unassuming compared to the elaborate carvings and iron filigree of others. But something about it pulled her forward. She pushed it open slowly, half expecting alarms or a shouting servant. But nothing happened. The room inside was a study, not a modern office, but an old-world library with high bookshelves, dusty furniture draped in white cloth, and a thick scent of old paper and faded perfume. She stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the faded rug. The fire had long since died in the hearth, but the air still carried the memory of warmth. On the desk lay an open book, its pages yellowed and covered in handwritten notes. Drawings, faces. One in particular repeated over and over, a woman with dark hair and a sharp, elegant profile. Her name was written in the margins. Celine. Rhiannon's heart stuttered. She recognized the name. During one of her earlier walks, she had paused at a closed door with an ornate brass plaque. It had read Celine's room. She had assumed it was a guest room. But now, looking at the sketches and journal entries, she realized Celine had once lived here. And not just lived, she had been important. She picked up the leather-bound journal resting on the edge of the desk. The handwriting was masculine, deliberate, occasionally messy in places where emotion had clearly overridden order. As she flipped through, the entries became increasingly personal. They chronicled the unraveling of a relationship, the descent of a woman into something dark and desperate, mentions of a fire, of betrayal, of a trial, and guilt, so much guilt. One sentence stood out, scrawled across an entire page like a confession too painful to contain. I killed her without touching her. I gave her the match and let her burn. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply, the journal clutched against her chest. Maddox stood in the doorway. He wasn't angry. That was what shocked her the most. His face was pale, drawn, but calm. There was no shout, no order, no demand that she explain herself. Only a weary exhale, like someone who had been waiting for this moment and already knew it would come. You weren't supposed to find that room, he said, stepping inside. He didn't take the journal from her, didn't try to hide it. He looked around instead, his eyes scanning the room like it was a crime scene. But maybe it's better that you did. Rhiannon opened her mouth, but no words came. Her mind was too full of fragments, questions, emotions, half-formed theories that crumbled under the weight of his presence. I loved her, he said quietly, or I thought I did. She was everything I wasn't, brilliant, passionate, untamed, but she was also reckless, addicted to chaos. She kept secrets, dangerous ones, and I thought I could save her. He sat in the old leather chair behind the desk, his posture rigid, like a man on trial. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by something older and sadder. She set the fire herself, he continued. Not in this house. Another one, a cabin in Vermont. Said she needed to cleanse herself, but she locked the doors. She knew I would come. She wanted me to break in, to save her, and I didn't. I froze. I waited too long. By the time I acted, the flames were everywhere. The roof collapsed. I dragged her out, but it was too late. His voice cracked, just barely. Rhiannon stood silently watching him, a man carved of stone, breaking in tiny, imperceptible lines. They said I killed her. The papers, the court, her family. No charges, but I was guilty just the same. So I disappeared. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. Rhiannon stepped forward and placed the journal gently back on the desk. Her voice, when she finally found it, was soft but firm. You didn't kill her, Maddox. You couldn't have saved someone who didn't want to be saved. He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. The walls he had built around himself for years cracked, just a little. She saw it, the relief, the grief, the longing, and she felt something dangerous stir in her chest. Not pity, not fear, but the beginning of something deeper. Something that scared her in a different way. That night she returned to her room not as a stranger, but as someone who had glimpsed the ghost that haunted Maddox Rourke. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a witness to a wound that still bled. And part of her, against all reason, wanted to help it heal. The morning after their conversation in the forgotten study, the house felt different to Rhiannon. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. An energy shift in the halls, a quiet hum that hadn't been there before. For days, the mansion had felt like a beautiful tomb, its grand walls echoing only with silence and memory. But now it felt like something was stirring awake, like breath returning to lungs long thought dead. And maybe it wasn't just the house. Maybe it was Maddox himself. Rhiannon found herself thinking of him constantly. She replayed his words, the break in his voice, the guilt etched into his features like a scar deeper than the one on his jaw. She saw him now not as the mysterious man who had taken her from a loveless home into a strange one, but as someone who had spent years in a cage of his own making, held not by iron bars but by memories and the crushing weight of guilt. She wondered what it felt like to carry that kind of grief alone. She wondered how long he had been waiting for someone to listen to him without judgment. And then she realized, with a kind of quiet clarity, that she didn't want to be a guest in his house. She wanted to be something more, something real. That evening, Maddox surprised her by knocking gently on her door. She had just finished brushing her hair, the firelight painting her skin in soft hues. He stood there with his sleeves rolled up and a look on his face that wasn't quite a smile but held the edges of one. There's dinner in the atrium, he said simply, if you want company. She followed him through the winding corridors, past tall windows and shadowed corners, until they reached a glass-domed room filled with plants and lanterns. The rain tapped gently above them, a rhythm steady and calming. In the center of the room, a table was set for two, simple but beautiful, with candles flickering and steam rising from silver dishes. It was not the grand affair of high society. It was something more intimate, carefully chosen, unpretentious, and thoughtful. They ate in relative silence at first, both uncertain how to navigate this new terrain between them. But as the meal progressed, the tension softened. Maddox spoke of the house, how it had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had built fortunes and enemies in equal measure. He explained how the estate had been abandoned after a scandal nearly ruined the family name, and how he had returned years later, determined to restore it not just physically, but spiritually. Rhiannon listened, asking questions gently, never prying, but drawing him out. She could see it in his eyes. He was used to people wanting pieces of him, his name, his wealth, his mystery, but not his truth. When she shared her own story, it came out more easily than she expected. She told him about Corliss's cruelty, the years of emotional starvation, the aching loneliness that had filled her like fog in winter. She spoke of her father, not the flawed man who had traded her away, but the quiet, brilliant person he had been before desperation changed him. Maddox didn't interrupt. He listened the way very few men did, fully, respectfully, without the need to fix or correct. When she finished, the silence that followed was not awkward, it was sacred. "I don't know what you expected when you took me," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "But I think I was expecting a monster. You don't look like one, and you don't act like one." Maddox didn't look away. "I've been one before," he said, "not in the way the tabloids paint me, but in the ways that matter. I've let people die. I've destroyed things I loved. But when I saw you standing in that drawing room, something in me shifted. You looked like someone who had already lived 1,000 quiet tragedies. I didn't want to be another one." Rhiannon's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You weren't. You're not." After dinner, they moved to the atrium's edge, where ivy curled around the glass, and the rain poured in sheets just beyond reach. Maddox poured them wine, and they sat in chairs near the tall palms and flowering vines, speaking in hushed tones about literature, music, the strange way time moved differently when you had no one to answer to. The hours slipped by unnoticed. At one point she laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, at a story he told about an ill-fated business dinner involving a broken heel, a plate of oysters, and a billionaire investor with shellfish allergies. Maddox watched her with open wonder, like the sound of her joy was something rare and sacred. And in that moment, something softened between them, not broken, not rushed, but gently unfolding like the petals of a flower, long thought dormant. When they rose to leave, Maddox didn't touch her. He simply walked her to her room, pausing at the doorway. The corridor was quiet, the candlelight casting a halo around them. "If I touch you," he said, voice low, raw with something close to longing, "I won't be able to stop." Rhiannon stepped forward, close enough to feel the heat of his body, the storm still crackling in the air between them. "Maybe I don't want you to stop," she whispered. He looked at her like she was both salvation and temptation, his control visibly fraying. But then, with agonizing restraint, he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with the barest touch of his fingers. "Not tonight," he said, barely audible. "You deserve more than ghosts in your bed." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her breathless in the doorway, her heart racing with something far more terrifying than fear. Hope. The morning after Maddox left her standing breathless in the doorway, Rhiannon awoke with a strange calm in her chest. It wasn't peace exactly, but a steadiness, as if something inside her had finally clicked into place. The memory of his touch still lingered, soft, reverent, restrained. There had been no demand, no claim, just a promise in his eyes that whatever came next would be on her terms. And that truth changed everything. In the days that followed, their relationship shifted. Maddox began seeking her out more often, not with grand gestures or overwhelming intensity, but with quiet constancy. He would invite her to walk the gardens at dusk, to sit beside him during breakfast in the solarium, to join him in the library where they'd each read in silence until one would break it with a thought or question. He never crossed the line, never pressed her for more than she was willing to give. And yet the air between them was charged with a growing intimacy, a gravitational pull that neither acknowledged but both obeyed. One afternoon, while wandering the West Wing, Rhiannon found an old music room hidden behind a faded tapestry. The door groaned open, revealing dust-covered instruments, forgotten sheet music, and a grand piano that seemed to sigh under the weight of its own silence. She hesitated before pressing a single key, the note ringing out into the emptiness like a call. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Her father had once taught her, before everything unraveled. That evening, Maddox found her there, her fingers hesitant on the keys as she tried to remember a melody from her childhood. He didn't speak. He sat beside her, close but not touching, and after a few minutes joined her with a quiet harmony on a cello that had been resting in the corner, as if waiting just for him. They played until the firelight flickered low and the music melted into laughter. Not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. Their connection deepened with each shared moment. Rhiannon began to feel not like a guest or even a dependent, but a partner. Maddox showed her the workings of his estate, the business operations, the charitable trusts he secretly funded, the innovation projects he backed anonymously. He brought her into conversations about investments, strategy, and legacy, and never once spoke down to her. She, in turn, offered insight, challenging ideas he hadn't re-examined in years. He called her sharp. She called him stubborn. They argued sometimes, but the arguments were alive, filled with fire and mutual respect. And then came the night that changed everything. It was a gala, something Maddox had avoided for years, but could no longer decline due to mounting pressure from his board and investors. He asked Rhiannon to accompany him, not as decoration, but as his equal. She said yes, though nerves fluttered in her stomach like caged birds. For the occasion, a stylist came to the estate with a selection of gowns, jewelry, and a team that transformed her into something ethereal. When Rhiannon walked into the grand foyer that evening, wearing a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure like it had been tailored by the wind, Maddox stopped breathing. He didn't speak at first. He simply stared, his gray eyes darkened with awe and something deeper, something dangerously close to reverence. When he did speak, his voice was husky. "You look like every dream I've tried to forget." They arrived at the gala to whispers and stares. Maddox Rourke hadn't been seen at an event in nearly a decade, and now at his side was a mysterious young woman with fire in her eyes and elegance in her every step. People speculated, envied, watched like hawks, but Maddox only looked at her. All night his hand hovered at her lower back, guiding her gently through crowds of investors and old acquaintances. Rhiannon carried herself with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. It was near midnight when the danger arrived. She recognized the voice before she saw the face. Well, well, if it isn't the girl who vanished into a billionaire's dungeon? Corliss. She stood near the bar clad in diamonds and arrogance, her arm draped over a man Rhiannon didn't recognize. Her newest financier, no doubt. Her eyes raked over Rhiannon with mocking disdain. Did he buy you a new dress too? Or are you still paying him back in silence? Maddox moved before Rhiannon could respond, placing himself between the two women, his jaw clenched. You're not welcome here, he said coldly. Leave. But Rhiannon stepped forward, her voice calm, clear, and devastating. Still bitter that you sold me cheap and I ended up priceless? The crowd froze. Corliss's smile faltered. Maddox placed a protective hand on Rhiannon's arm, but she didn't need protection. Not anymore. Corliss, ever the opportunist, tried to recover. You're still a child playing pretend. I could end this little fantasy with a single call. Rhiannon smiled sweetly. Try it. And this time, when you lie, remember I'm not locked in your house anymore. I have a voice, and I'm not afraid to use it. Word spread quickly after that. Rumors swirled, the press sniffed around, and within days, Corliss retaliated with legal threats. She claimed Maddox had groomed Rhiannon, that the inheritance she had hidden away was rightfully hers, that Rhiannon was unstable. She filed injunctions, leaked doctor documents, and appeared on gossip shows spinning a tale of stolen wealth and emotional abuse. But Maddox was ready. He had anticipated Corliss's next move, and while Rhiannon had been rediscovering her power, he had quietly built a legal case against her, gathering evidence of her financial manipulation, coercion, and the shady deals she had brokered to keep herself in designer heels and high circles. When the lawsuit went public, Corliss found herself under intense scrutiny. Bank accounts were frozen, assets seized, friends disappeared like smoke. And through it all, Rhiannon stood strong. She testified. She told her story not with tears, but with calm conviction. When Maddox sat beside her at the courthouse, he didn't hold her hand out of possessiveness. He held it like a lifeline. By the time the judge ruled in Rhiannon's favor, awarding her full control over her father's estate and condemning Corliss for fraud and psychological abuse, the world had already begun to see her not as a girl rescued from darkness, but as a woman who had burned her own way out. That night back at the mansion, Rhiannon stood by the balcony as the sea roared below. Maddox joined her, saying nothing at first. Then gently he reached for her hand. "You saved yourself," he said. "I was just the one lucky enough to witness it." Rhiannon turned to him, her eyes bright with a storm that no longer scared her. "You didn't save me, Maddox. You gave me the space to become who I already was." He leaned in, and this time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no restraint. It was not a question, it was an answer. And it said everything they had both waited far too long to hear. The morning after the courthouse victory felt like the first page of an entirely new life. The mansion no longer loomed in Rhiannon's mind as a place of exile or confusion, but as a symbol of transformation. It was no longer someone else's fortress. It was hers now, in every meaningful sense. The ghosts hadn't disappeared, but they had gone quiet, watching respectfully as the living reclaimed their place. Maddox seemed lighter too, though his heaviness hadn't vanished completely. Some grief, Rhiannon had learned, doesn't leave. It simply becomes part of who you are. But now, instead of carrying it alone, he carried it with her. In the weeks that followed the trial, the world responded with a mix of fascination and admiration. Media outlets that had once whispered about scandal were now writing glowing profiles on the girl who had stood up in court and spoken with unshakable composure. "From captive to queen," one headline read. Another declared her the new face of empowered legacy. Rhiannon didn't seek the attention, but she didn't shy from it either. She had learned that visibility was a kind of power, one Corliss had always denied her. Now she used it deliberately. Together, she and Maddox began reshaping the legacy they had inherited and earned. They started with the estate itself. The western wing, once sealed off like a shrine to loss, was reopened and restored. The study where Rhiannon had first read Celine's name became a reading room for guests. The gardens were replanted, the glass atrium converted into a gallery space for young, underrepresented artists. The music room was tuned and opened, and every Sunday evening it filled with the soft sounds of cello and piano, played not just by Maddox and Rhiannon, but sometimes by visitors, friends, and those from the local conservatory whom they quietly sponsored. But it was the charity work that came to define them. Rhiannon spearheaded the creation of a foundation, named not after herself, but after a woman no one had saved. The Celine Initiative was designed to identify, protect, and empower young women trapped in coercive or abusive situations, especially those who, like Rhiannon, had been hidden behind wealth or social silence. Maddox funded the initiative in full at first, writing the largest check of his life without a moment's hesitation. But Rhiannon refused to let it exist as a side project or vanity mission. She worked every day, side by side with lawyers, therapists, and outreach workers, reading case files, visiting safe houses, and making personal calls to donors. She wasn't the quiet girl from the attic anymore. She had become the storm. Their relationship deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Love for them wasn't loud or performative. It was building glances across crowded rooms, in late-night strategy meetings, in the way Maddox handed her coffee exactly the way she liked it without asking. It lived in the moments between, when they moved through the house in sync, when their hands found each other without thinking, when the world became chaos and their shared silence became sanctuary. But love was not the end of conflict. It was merely the beginning of building something real. Their pasts still rose up, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in arguments neither of them knew how to finish. Maddox, despite his tenderness, struggled with control. He was used to solving problems with money and power, and Rhiannon, for all her gratitude, refused to be solved. They fought over decisions in the foundation, over how public Rhiannon should be, over how Maddox sometimes defaulted to shielding her when she didn't need to be protected. Yet through each argument, they came back to the table. They apologized. They evolved, and in doing so, they created a love that wasn't perfect, but was profoundly, fiercely true. One night, well past midnight, Maddox found her in the observatory, seated cross-legged on the velvet chaise, wrapped in a shawl, staring up at the stars. The telescope beside her was still warm from recent use. When he sat beside her, she didn't turn immediately. She was deep in thought, and he knew better than to interrupt that. After a while, she said, "Do you think people like us can really change the world? Or do we just decorate the cage differently?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think if anyone can change it, it's someone who's lived in the cage and walked out with the keys." She smiled, tired but real. "Then we should start unlocking doors." The next morning, Rhiannon proposed an expansion of the foundation, one that would go beyond aid and address the legal system itself. She wanted to create a task force of young legal scholars, social workers, and survivors who would identify loopholes in guardianship laws, inheritance rights, and coercive abuse statutes. She called it the Open Gate Project. Within 2 months, it had secured backing from international human rights organizations. Within a year, it had overturned 3 archaic laws in the state of South Carolina. With each victory, Rhiannon grew bolder. She traveled, spoke at summits, testified in front of committees. Maddox went with her when he could, standing quietly in the background, his presence a fortress of quiet strength. When he couldn't, he stayed behind to manage their shared affairs and watched her on live streams, his heart swelling with something deeper than pride. She had once belonged to no one, not even to herself. Now she belonged only to the future she was helping build. And yet, for all the press, the accolades, the momentum, their most sacred moments remained private. Maddox still cooked for her on Friday nights, experimenting with recipes they never quite perfected. They still danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. She still read him poetry at dawn, her voice soft and slow, while he sipped black coffee and held her ankle under the blanket like a tether to the waking world. Love in the quiet was still the most radical act of all. One evening, while they walked the cliffside garden together, hand in hand, Rhiannon stopped beneath the old sycamore tree overlooking the sea. The wind pulled at her hair, and the salt air stung their skin, but neither moved. "I don't ever want to forget who I was before this," she said. Maddox looked at her solemn. "You haven't, but you're not that girl anymore." "I know," she whispered, "but she survived, and I owe her everything." He kissed her hand then, pressing it to his chest. "So do I." The wind howled above them, but they didn't move. They stood there in the twilight, not as symbols, not as survivors, not even as lovers, but as two people who had weathered storms both inside and out, and had come through not unbroken, but remade. Not as who the world expected them to be, but as exactly who they had chosen to become. By the beginning of autumn, Rhiannon had become more than just a public figure. She had evolved into a force. Her name carried weight not because of the mansion she lived in or the man at her side, but because of the change she insisted upon in the world around her. The foundation's success had snowballed into something massive. What had started as a quiet mission to protect the vulnerable had now become a catalyst for systemic reform across the country. Her calendar was filled with appearances, meetings with senators, interviews with global publications, and private sessions with women who had survived stories eerily similar to her own. Maddox watched all of it unfold with a reverent kind of awe, standing slightly behind the spotlight she now carried. Though the world assumed he had brought her power, those closest to them saw the truth. She had brought him back to life. He was no longer the man haunted by a past tragedy, hiding in the echoing halls of his estate. He had transformed too, less guarded, less cynical, more grounded in something real. He had once defined himself by what he had lost. Now he defined himself by what he was building alongside her. But with visibility came danger. Not from Corliss. She was rotting in prison, her influence gone, her name reduced to nothing more than a cautionary footnote, but from something more abstract and far-reaching. Power attracts resistance. The Open Gate Project, with all its ambition to challenge outdated laws and hold institutions accountable, began to draw ire from those in power who had grown comfortable in the shadows. Anonymous threats arrived. Funding was quietly pulled by organizations afraid of being associated with a cause too disruptive. News articles began to question her motivations, suggesting she was too young, too inexperienced, too emotional. "The girl who got too loud," one headline sneered. Rhiannon was shaken but not broken. She had faced worse. She knew what it was like to be silenced. She had no intention of letting it happen again. But Maddox saw the toll it took. The late nights staring at reports she could barely read through exhausted eyes. The quiet moments when she would sit at the edge of their bed, fingers gripping the mattress as if grounding herself. She hadn't cried. Not once. But she had grown quiet in a new way. Measured, calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. One evening, after a particularly brutal board meeting in which a key partner pulled their support with a cold smile and flimsy excuse, Maddox took her away without warning. No discussions, no explanations. He simply walked into her office, closed her laptop, and said, "Get in the car." They drove in silence for nearly 2 hours, winding through country roads bathed in the soft amber of fading sunlight. Rhiannon didn't ask where they were going. She just watched the trees blur past, her hand resting in his as if trusting him to lead her somewhere she could breathe. Eventually, they arrived at a place she didn't recognize. A small lake tucked into the hills, surrounded by a grove of old trees that filtered the sky into golden green. There was no one else in sight. A picnic basket waited on a blanket, and 2 lanterns flickered gently at the edges of the grass. He led her to the water's edge and sat beside her. For a long time, they said nothing. The air was cool, the world silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Finally, he said, "You're allowed to rest, Rhiannon. The world won't end if you stop for a day." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It might," she whispered. "Or maybe it won't. But what if it forgets me?" He turned to her, gently taking her face in his hands. "You're unforgettable. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You've already changed things. You're allowed to be human. You don't have to prove your worth every second." Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "I've been fighting my whole life, first to survive, then to speak, then to matter. I don't know how to stop." Maddox kissed her then. Not like a promise, not like an apology, but like a reminder that she was more than her fight, that she was loved without condition, that she could be soft and thus still be powerful. That night they slept beneath the stars, wrapped in one another. No speeches, no cameras, no battles to win, just the wind and the dark, and the sound of her breath settling into peace. When they returned to the estate the next morning, she was different, still fierce, still driven, but grounded again. She delegated more, trusted her team, took time for herself without guilt. And Maddox, always perceptive, continued to create spaces where she could just be. He built her a garden where no business meetings were allowed. He filled their reading room with new books every week. He blocked out Sundays for her. No interruptions, no decisions, just them. The world didn't slow down. In fact, it pushed harder. But Rhiannon no longer let it take from her what she had fought so hard to reclaim: her voice, her rest, her joy. As fall deepened, an invitation arrived from the United Nations. She had been selected as the keynote speaker for an upcoming summit on legal reform and women's rights. Maddox watched as she read the letter, her lips curving into a smile, equal parts awe and determination. "They want me to speak in Geneva," she said. He nodded. "They should have asked you years ago." She laughed, then sobered. "Are you scared?" "Yes," he said truthfully. "But I trust you more than I fear what comes next." They flew to Switzerland together. She stood before hundreds, diplomats, world leaders, activists, and delivered a speech that would later be quoted in history books. She spoke of silent girls in shadowed homes, of power disguised as love, of laws written by hands that had never trembled in fear. And then she spoke of change, real, painful, necessary change, and how it always began with a single voice refusing to be silenced. She ended with a truth that silenced the room. "I am not here because someone saved me. I am here because I was finally given space to save myself. And that's what every woman deserves. Not rescue, but freedom." When she stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in applause. And in the front row, Maddox rose to his feet, his eyes shining with unshed tears, clapping like his heart depended on it. Back at the hotel that night, she curled into his side, exhausted but glowing. "We did it," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "No, you did." And in the silence that followed, Neither of them needed to say what they both felt, that this wasn't the end of their fight or their story. It was only the beginning of the legacy they were building together. The first snow of winter fell quietly over the estate, blanketing the once verdant grounds in soft white silence. The gardens that had bloomed so defiantly under Rhiannon's touch now rested under frost, hibernating like the chapters of a book that had been read and closed, waiting for spring. Inside the mansion, warmth pulsed through the walls, not just from the flickering hearths or the scent of cinnamon and pine that lingered in every room, but from something deeper, something that had taken root between two people who had once lived in the shadow of survival and now existed in the full light of purpose. Rhiannon stood before the mirror in the sunroom, the early light of day breaking gently through the tall windows, gilding her skin with gold. Her reflection no longer startled her. She didn't see a girl displaced or a pawn traded by those meant to protect her. She saw a woman formed by fire and healed in her own image. Her hair hung loose down her back, her eyes steady and clear, her posture tall. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't waiting for permission. She belonged to herself, to her work, to the life she had built piece by piece from the wreckage of another. That morning was different, and she knew it even before the day began. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air, a soft buzz in the hallways as staff moved with practiced discretion, hiding smiles and darting glances. Maddox had left her a note at breakfast. Wear something warm. Meet me by the East Path at 10. No questions. Just trust me. She'd smiled when she read it, the edges of her mouth curling with the familiar mix of amusement and affection that came only when he was up to something. She found him standing beneath the arched trellis at the far end of the garden, where frost had formed tiny chandeliers along the iron. He was dressed in black, coat, gloves, scarf, but his eyes were bright, warmed by something fierce and tender. Behind him, the trees opened to reveal a new trail, one she hadn't noticed before. He didn't speak. He simply offered her his hand. They walked together through the woods, snow crunching beneath their boots, the only sound aside from the gentle rustle of wind through the branches. For once, there was no need for conversation. Their silence was not filled with things left unsaid. It was full of things that had already been spoken, again and again, in the way they moved together, the way they understood each other's rhythms like music. Eventually, the trail widened, opening onto a small clearing where a wooden gazebo stood nestled among the trees, dressed in soft white lights and ivy garlands that hadn't yet succumbed to the cold. A fire crackled in a stone pit nearby, casting dancing shadows. On the table inside the gazebo, there was a single velvet box and a folded envelope. Rhiannon looked at him, startled, and Maddox stepped forward with a smile that was nothing short of reverent. "I've had a lot of titles in my life," he began, his voice calm but deep with emotion. "Businessman, heir, recluse, criminal, all of them meant something. Some were earned, some were forced, but the only title I've ever truly wanted is yours." He opened the box. Inside was a ring unlike anything Rhiannon had imagined, not large or ostentatious, but elegant and deeply personal. A simple band of intertwined rose gold and silver, engraved with the words "still here, still yours." Her breath caught in her throat. "I didn't buy you," he said, "and I never will. I'm not asking for what's owed or expected. I'm asking for what's chosen. Because you're not just the woman I love, you're the woman who saved me. You turned silence into music. You made this place a home. You made me human again." He knelt. "So I'm asking, not as the man who met you in the dark, but as the one who watched you walk into your own light. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer with words. She dropped to her knees beside him, the snow cold against her legs, and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder as tears slipped down her cheeks. Tears of joy, of release, of something that felt like coming home. "Yes," she whispered finally. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They didn't rush the wedding. They didn't need to. Their lives were already threaded together so tightly that a ceremony felt more like a celebration than a beginning. Still, when the day came, early spring, with the garden in full bloom, they stood beneath the same sycamore tree on the cliff's edge, where so many moments between them had unfolded. The guests were few. The women Rhiannon had helped rescue, the mentors and friends they had gathered over the years, and staff who had become family. The vows they exchanged weren't promises of perfection. They were promises of truth, of presence, of choosing each other every day, even on the ones when love felt hard. Afterward, as the sun dipped below the horizon and laughter echoed through the estate, Maddox and Rhiannon slipped away from the reception. They wandered back through the garden, hands entwined, champagne glasses forgotten. As they reached the balcony overlooking the sea, Rhiannon rested her head against his chest. "You know," she murmured, "I used to dream of being rescued, of someone finding me and pulling me out of the dark. But that was before I knew I could climb." He kissed the top of her head. "You didn't need saving. You just needed someone to hold the rope." In the years that followed, their legacy deepened. The Celine Initiative expanded globally, and Open Gate reformed laws across 5 countries. They adopted 2 children, both survivors of broken systems, and raised them in a home built on transparency, compassion, and resilience. Rhiannon wrote a memoir that spent 60 weeks on the bestseller list, not because it was glamorous, but because it was raw and real and brave. Maddox eventually sold his remaining businesses, choosing instead to teach and mentor young leaders who reminded him of the man he could have been had someone believed in him sooner. But their greatest success wasn't measured in awards or articles. It was found in the quiet rituals of their life. The way Rhiannon still played the piano on rainy afternoons, the way Maddox still left her notes folded in her books, the way they still met at the sycamore tree every year on the day he had proposed, just to say it again, still here, still yours. And in the end, when people spoke of them, they didn't speak of the scandal or the darkness that had once defined them. They spoke of the love that had grown out of the ashes, the woman who was sold but never surrendered, the man who had everything and gave it all to earn something real. 2 souls who found each other in ruin and chose, again and again, to rebuild together.